2005. The Metropolitan Detention Center in Brooklyn. Two men are led out to the recreation area, each into his own steel exercise cage, standing about 6 inches apart with nothing but wire between them. One of them is Vincent Basciano, the acting boss of the Bonanno crime family, 45 years old. Hair still immaculate even in federal custody. The other is Joseph Massino, the man who gave him that job, the boss he came up under, the closest thing he has to a father in that world. Basciano starts talking. He talks the way he always talks, fast and loud and certain, and at one point he says the line that will be played back to a jury 6 years later. "I'm a hoodlum. I'm a tough guy. Whatever happens, happens. Let's go." He has no idea that Joseph Massino is wearing a wire. You probably know the nickname. Vinny Gorgeous. It's one of those names the tabloids loved, because it came with a ready-made punchline attached. A mob boss who used to own a beauty salon in the Bronx called Hello Gorgeous. For 20 years, that's how this man has been covered. The hairdresser gangster, the vain one, the guy who kept his hair perfect in a Supermax. It's a great headline, and it's completely useless as history, because it turns a genuinely important case into a joke about a blow-dryer. Here's what that nickname buries. Vincent Basciano is the reason we can say something that had never been said before in the history of the American Mafia. He was brought down by a sitting boss of one of New York's 5 families who put on a recording device and walked into a prison yard to catch him. That had never happened. Not once. Bosses had been killed. Bosses had been convicted. Bosses had died in prison, keeping their mouths shut for 40 years. No boss of a New York family had ever agreed to work for the government against his own people. Joseph Massino did, and the man he did it to was standing 6 inches away, wearing his best face, running his mouth. This isn't a story about a hairdresser who got in over his head. It's the story of what happens when an organization built entirely on silence produces one man who cannot stop talking, and another who understood, before anyone else did, that silence was already worthless. And it's about a job that by 2004 had become the single most dangerous position in organized crime, a job Basciano wanted badly enough to kill for. Start in the Bronx, because the Bronx explains him. Vincent John Basciano was born November 14th, 1959. He came up in a New York where the Banano family was the punchline of the 5 families, the one that had been thrown off the Mafia Commission entirely after an FBI agent named Joe Pistone spent 6 years inside the family, posing as a jewel thief named Donnie Brasco. That humiliation defined the Bananos for a generation. They were the family that got infiltrated. Everyone else got to look down on them. That history is worth understanding properly, because it shaped the organization Basciano walked into. Pistone's operation in the late 1970s and early 80s didn't just embarrass the Bananos. It got members killed, it produced convictions, and it cost the family its seat at the table where the 5 families settled their business. For years afterward, the Bananos were the family other crews wouldn't deal with directly, because you never knew who you were actually talking to. Being a Bonanno in that era meant carrying a permanent question mark. That's the culture Vincent Basciano was raised in professionally, a family desperate to prove it was serious again, where a reputation for hardness wasn't vanity, it was rehabilitation. Basciano's route in was through a captain named Patrick DeFilippo, known as Patty from the Bronx, and by most accounts Basciano was formally inducted as a made member of the Bonanno family around 1991. DeFilippo's own ending tells you what this life paid out in the long run. He was sentenced to 35 years and died in prison in 2013. He was also, at the same time, a legitimate small business owner. The beauty salon was real. Hello Gorgeous, in the Bronx, and the nickname came from that plus his own fastidiousness. The pressed clothes, the hair, the grooming. People in the neighborhood knew him as both things at once, and neither one was a cover for the other. That combination matters more than it sounds. A salon is a place where people sit still for an hour and talk. It is, structurally, an intelligence operation with a cash register. And Basciano was running gambling on the side, the kind of neighborhood book that produced steady money without producing much attention, at least at first. Here's how the gambling piece actually worked, because it's the engine underneath everything else. A neighborhood sportsbook takes bets on games, holds the money and pays out on winners while keeping a percentage on the losers. Done at scale, across enough customers, it's essentially a machine that converts other people's optimism into a reliable weekly income. It doesn't require violence most of the time. What it requires is a collection network, a way to move cash, and a reputation strong enough that nobody seriously considers not paying. That reputation is the whole business. The money is downstream of the fear. And Basciano was good at it. Good enough that when the roof came off the Bonanno family, he was standing close enough to the top to get handed what was left. Because in 2004, the roof came off. Joseph Massino, the boss who had spent years rebuilding the Bananos from the Donnie Brasco disaster into arguably the strongest family in New York, was arrested and convicted. And when Massino went down, somebody had to run things. That job went to Vincent Basciano. Understand what he was actually accepting. By 2004, acting boss of a New York family was not a promotion. It was a target with a title. Federal prosecutors had spent 2 decades learning to decapitate these organizations, and the acting boss was the one name every investigator in the Eastern District already had circled. The real boss sat in prison and stayed insulated. The acting boss stood in the open and absorbed the indictments. Everybody in that world knew it. There's a reason the position existed at all, and it says something bleak about how these organizations treated their own people. The acting boss structure was designed as a shock absorber. It let an imprisoned boss keep drawing income and keep making decisions while somebody else's name appeared on the wiretap transcripts and the surveillance photos. In practical terms, the family was asking one man to volunteer as the lightning rod, so the rest of the structure could stay dry. Men took it anyway, because in an organization where status was the only real currency, being the visible boss of a crumbling family still felt like winning. Basciano took the job and then did something that tells you everything about him. He decided people needed to be reminded who was in charge. On November 30th, 2004, a Bonanno associate named Randolph Pizzolo was shot and killed in Brooklyn. Pizzolo was not a rival. He wasn't a threat to anyone's position. By the government's account, he was a loudmouth, an associate who caused problems and didn't listen, the kind of low-level irritant that in a functional organization gets a warning and a slap. Prosecutors alleged that Basciano ordered him killed for a reason that had nothing to do with Pizzolo personally. He was killed to send a message that Basciano was firmly in charge. That's the decision the entire rest of this story hangs on, so sit with the logic of it. A man newly handed a leadership position in an organization already crawling with informants, already under federal siege, already down one boss, decides that what the situation requires is a fresh homicide to establish his authority. Not consolidation, not caution, a body. As a business card. There was another killing in his record too, and it complicates him in a way that's worth being honest about. In 2007, Basciano was convicted of the 2001 murder of a man named Frank Santoro. The stated motive was that Santoro had tried to kidnap Basciano's son. That doesn't make it legal and it doesn't make it right, but it makes it human in a way the Pizzolo killing simply is not. One murder came from a father's rage, the other came from a manager's memo. And the second one is what ended him. Now here's where the whole thing turns, and it turns on the man Basciano trusted most. Joseph Massino, sitting in prison, facing the rest of his life, made a decision no boss of a New York family had ever made. In 2004, he began cooperating with the government. Big Joey Massino, the last boss standing, the man who had rebuilt the Bananos, became the highest-ranking member of the 5 families ever to break the oath and work for the other side. People still argue about why, and the honest answer is that the pressure on him was close to unsurvivable. He had already been convicted on a stack of murder counts. He was looking at spending the remainder of his life in federal custody with no realistic appeal, and prosecutors had further charges available that carried the possibility of a death sentence. Whatever else you want to say about the man, he did the arithmetic that every one of his own soldiers had been doing for years under the same pressure, and he came to the same conclusion they did. The difference is that when a soldier flips, the organization survives it. When the boss flips, the organization is finished, because everything runs through him. Massino knew the names, the murders, the structure, the history. He was not a witness to the Bonanno family. He was its archive. And among the things Massino told his handlers was this. Basciano had talked to him about killing a federal prosecutor. The prosecutor's name was Greg Andres, an assistant United States attorney who had been central to dismantling the Bonanno leadership. According to what Massino reported, Basciano had floated killing Andres in an Italian restaurant on the Upper East Side, as payback for what the government had done to the family, and because Basciano was furious that prosecutors were planning to subpoena his wife. But there was a problem with Massino's account, and it's a detail most retellings skip entirely. The government polygraphed him about that conversation, and he failed. Think about what that meant for the FBI. Their historic cooperator, the biggest catch in the history of the American Mafia, had just told them the most explosive thing imaginable, that a sitting acting boss wanted to murder a federal prosecutor, and their own machine said he might be lying about it. They couldn't take that to a jury. They needed Basciano to say it himself. So Massino agreed to wear a wire. That's how two men who had known each other for years ended up in adjacent steel cages in a Brooklyn federal jail, 6 inches apart, one of them recording. And what the tapes captured is one of the strangest documents in modern mafia history, because it isn't an interrogation. It's two men reminiscing. At one point, Massino, playing his part, gets wistful about what the family used to be. "We was okay until I got pinched," he says. "We was on top of the world." Massino never got the clean confession about Greg Andres. Basciano never said it plainly enough. But he said plenty of other things. And the thing he said clearly, freely, without much prompting at all, was that he had ordered the murder of Randolph Pizzolo. He handed the government the case into a microphone. Standing next to the one man in the world he should have been most careful around, because that man had every conceivable reason to trade him, and nothing left to lose by doing it. Consider the two of them, because they are almost perfect opposites, and the contrast is the actual lesson here. Joseph Massino survived at the top for years by being boring. He was famously careful, famously quiet, a man who reportedly wouldn't say certain names out loud and communicated through gestures rather than words. He built his power on the assumption that anything spoken could be recorded. Vincent Basciano built his identity on being seen. The nickname, the salon, the clothes, the hair, the swagger, "I'm a hoodlum, I'm a tough guy." One man treated attention as a fatal risk, the other treated it as the entire point. And here's the bitter joke at the center of it. The careful one, the man who never said anything he didn't have to, ended up saying everything to federal agents on the record in open court. The loud one is the one who got buried by his own voice. Massino's caution eventually bought him a deal. Basciano's performance bought him a life sentence. The trials came in sequence, and they ground him down. In 2006, he was convicted of racketeering charges involving illegal gambling and attempted murder, though that jury hung on the Santoro murder. Prosecutors retried the hung counts, and in August of 2007 convicted him of killing Santoro. Then came the big one. On May 16, 2011, Basciano was convicted of ordering the murder of Randolph Pizzolo. The government asked for the death penalty. It's worth pausing on how rare that is in a mafia case. And on June 1, 2011, the jury said no. They gave him life without parole instead. There's a reported detail from that period that captures the man completely. He had spent roughly 4 years in solitary confinement by the time of that final trial, and reporters in the courtroom noted that he still turned up looking immaculate, perfectly groomed. 4 years in a box, facing execution, and the hair was right. He was sent initially to ADX Florence in Colorado, the federal supermax, the most isolating prison in the country. Over the years, he was moved, first to a nearby high-security penitentiary in Florence, then to Big Sandy, and he is currently held at the federal penitentiary in Coleman, Florida. He will not get out. So what does this case actually mean, past the nickname? It means the American Mafia's central technology finally failed, and it failed from the top down rather than the bottom up. For most of the 20th century, the code of silence worked because it was enforced by consequence and because the men at the top had the most to lose by breaking it. What happened between 2004 and 2011 inverted that completely. The boss flipped first. The man at the very top ran the numbers, saw that the organization could no longer protect him, and made the same rational calculation any of his soldiers might have made. Once that happened, the oath wasn't a principle anymore. It was just a policy, and policies get changed. Basciano never understood that the ground had moved. He was still performing a version of the job that had stopped existing, still doing gangster the way it looked in the movies and the tabloids, still convinced that swagger and reputation were assets rather than evidence. He ordered a man killed to prove he was in charge of an organization that was already being taken apart, and then described that decision out loud to a man wearing a recording device. The Pizzolo murder is the part that should stay with you, though, because Randolph Pizzolo did not die in a war or a power struggle or over money. By the government's account, he died because a new acting boss needed a demonstration. He was a communications tool. Whatever else you think about the men in this story, that is the part with a real person underneath it. Someone whose family got a phone call because a man they'd never met wanted to make a point about his own authority. And the authority lasted a few months. The point he was making evaporated into a life sentence in a federal penitentiary 2 states away from anyone who ever called him gorgeous. If you want more real history behind the headlines, subscribe. We publish a new investigation every week. And drop a comment below, because this one is worth arguing about. Joseph Massino was the first New York boss in history to wear a wire against his own people. Does that make him the smartest man in this story? Or the lowest?